In the summer of 1904, just before dawn, a rail crew cutting through a low Arkansas ridge hit something that did not sound like stone, not bedrock, not shale, not timber, hollow. One laborer later said the impact rang through the cut like a knock on a church door buried under the hill. The crew had been working by lantern light, widening a narrow pass for a new line through hard red earth when the wall gave way and exposed a dark cavity just beyond the blasting scar. At first they thought it was a pocket, maybe an old root chamber, maybe a sink, maybe nothing. Then the foreman brought the lamp closer. Inside the opening, behind packed clay and veins of chalk-white dust, something curved out of the darkness. Pale, smooth, too large to be a branch, too regular to be rock. A bone. And not just one bone, a row of them. Long, arched forms, stacked at angles no animal anyone there could name should have had. A rib cage wider than a man's shoulders, joint sockets thick as fists, and further back, half sunk in the chamber floor, a skull so large one witness said it looked like a horse's head shaped by human sorrow. By sunrise, the opening was gone. That is the part nobody argues about. The cut was backfilled before full light. Extra dirt was ordered in. Men were told to keep moving. The section log, according to later accounts, marked a minor collapse. No mention of a chamber, no mention of remains, no mention of why armed men from town were suddenly seen near a rail job before breakfast. So what exactly did they open in that Arkansas hill? A burial chamber? A cave? A fraud? A misidentified deposit? Or something far worse for the official story of who lived here, how large they were, and what else may still be sealed under American ground. Because the rail cut was only the beginning. Over the years, fragments of the story kept resurfacing in places they were never supposed to survive. A worker's letter, a widow's memory, a torn survey note, a county rumor repeated so often it stopped sounding like rumor. Each one added the same disturbing detail. The bones were not animal, they were arranged. The chamber was old, and somebody important wanted it buried before the sun made witnesses out of everybody. That is what makes this case dangerous. Not because giant bones were allegedly found. Stories like that exist all over the American interior. Most are easy to dismiss. Most collapse under bad retellings and carnival exaggeration. This one doesn't collapse so neatly because it comes attached to a place, a time, a work crew, a rail cut, a rushed backfill, and the oldest kind of fear in hidden history. Ordinary men seeing something impossible, then watching power arrive before explanation does. And once you notice that pattern, the question changes. It is no longer, did they find something strange in Arkansas? It becomes, how many times has the ground opened, and how many times did someone make sure it was closed again before morning?
The official version begins the way official versions often do. A route expansion. A hard section of ridge, routine blasting, minor instability in the wall, work interruption, repair, resume. Clean, mechanical, forgettable. But forgotten stories rarely stay buried when too many people were there to see the first crack. According to later retellings passed down through two local families tied to the line camp, the crew that morning was not made up of scholars, soldiers, or treasure men. They were hired bodies, pickmen, shovelmen, muckers, the kind of workers who knew rock by smell and soil by color. Men who did not have polished language for archaeology, but knew when earth looked untouched and when a space had been made by hands. One of them was said to be a quiet track laborer named Eli Mercer, a widower who lodged with his sister outside town and kept pocket notebooks for wages, weather, and unusual events. His original notebook has never surfaced, but decades later, a granddaughter reportedly repeated one line she said had been read aloud in the family. Wall opened on the left cut. Chamber worked smooth inside. bones set in order, not natural. Set in order. That phrase matters, because random remains are one thing, ordered remains are another. Ordered remains mean intent, ritual, burial, memory. They mean somebody put those bones there on purpose and expected the chamber to stay closed. The same family account claimed the crew first saw what looked like giant leg bones laid parallel near the rear wall, with smaller fragments gathered near the torso area, as if collapse had broken part of the upper frame. Another witness, quoted years later by a local amateur historian, described stone shelves cut into the chamber's sides and a floor harder than the surrounding soil, almost like packed lime or ancient mortar. If even half of that is true, then this was not a random cave pocket full of washed-in debris. It was a built space. And then the story gets stranger. Less than an hour after the opening, before the full crew from the lower camp had even rotated up, the foreman was allegedly told to stop all inspection and pull men back from the face. Not because it was unsafe, because county people were coming. No names, no titles, just county people. By some accounts, they came with 2 outsiders, by others, with 1 doctor and 1 man in a dark coat carrying a case. In almost every version, though, the same details repeat. Nobody from the crew was allowed inside the chamber again. Measurements were taken quickly. Several smaller items were wrapped in cloth, and the opening was filled before noon. Orders were entered. Why move that fast unless the discovery meant something? And why classify it as a collapse unless the truth of what was found created a bigger problem than the find itself? This is where the case stops sounding like a campfire story and starts sounding like a controlled event. Because once the site is redefined on paper, the witnesses become unreliable by design. A burial chamber becomes a cave-in, bones become debris, a sealed space becomes damaged ground, and anyone who objects can be dismissed as a laborer who saw too little, too early, in bad light after blasting. It is the perfect burial, not just of remains, of language.
If the Arkansas chamber story rested on one family memory, it would be easy to shelve it with every other frontier legend that grew taller with each retelling. But it didn't stay in one family. That is where the pressure starts to build. Years after the rail cut, scattered references to oversized remains and sealed openings began appearing around the same corridor of land, sometimes attached to unrelated stories, sometimes spoken as warnings, sometimes buried inside local history notes that seemed almost afraid of their own details. A survey assistant reportedly mentioned a bone room in a ridge near the works. A church deacon's son later told of hearing old men argue over whether the laborers had seen one giant or several. And in one especially unsettling account, a widow claimed her husband came home that morning gray-faced, washed his hands 3 times, and said, "They were people, but not our size." That line survived because it does not sound embellished, it sounds frightened. Then there is the matter of the missing sketch. A county history collector in the 1930s supposedly interviewed one surviving railhand who said a quick drawing had been made before the chamber was sealed, not a full survey, just a rough sketch showing the opening, the slope of the cut, and the position of the largest visible remains. He claimed the drawing was taken with other papers and never returned. No archive has produced it, no museum lists it, no state office admits holding it. But you start hearing about missing things a lot around cases like this. Missing pages, missing boxes, missing labels, missing bags from old digs that were later reclassified. Sometimes the missing thing is the item itself. Sometimes it is only the description. Either way, the effect is the same. The object becomes impossible to verify, and the story is left to rot in the gap between memory and permission. Then comes the rehook nobody in this niche ignores: the newspapers. If a chamber full of giant bones was opened during active rail work, why is there no clean local article celebrating the discovery? Frontier papers printed thinner stories than this all the time. Odd fossils, strange stones, cave finds, giant trees, deformed calves, buried relics. Local editors loved sensation when it sold. So why the silence here? One answer is that there was no discovery worth printing. Another is that the discovery was printed, then buried in language so vague it vanished in plain sight. Researchers who dug into regional press patterns from that era pointed to a familiar tactic: reports of unusual finds reframed as ancient remains, Indian curiosities, pre-settlement bones, or excavation objects, stripped of size, stripped of context, stripped of the one feature that would make the public ask dangerous questions. The public sees a small curiosity. The record keeps moving. The site closes, the ridge is cut deeper, the evidence disappears under rail, gravel, and time. But even that may not be the darkest possibility, because what if the chamber was not simply a grave discovered by accident? What if it was known, marked about, whispered about, and the rail line was pushed through anyway because industrial expansion is one of the oldest tools for erasing difficult ground? A road flattens memory. A station redefines the map. A cut through a ridge destroys layers faster than any argument can save them. And once the grade is laid, the landscape itself testifies against the past. Nothing to see here, it says. Just railroad.
To understand why a giant bone chamber in Arkansas would be buried instead of studied, you have to step back from the chamber and look at the pattern. This is never about one hole in one hill. It is about what keeps happening whenever remains, architecture, or human proportions begin to threaten the timeline people have already agreed to defend. Across the 19th and early 20th centuries, stories surfaced again and again from the American interior. Oversized skeletons in mounds, unusually large skulls, sealed chambers in ridges, burial vaults opened during road cuts, bones found under foundations, then lost, removed, mislabeled, or explained away. Most were fragmented, many were mocked, some were likely exaggerated. But the pattern is not that every story is true. The pattern is that the response is always the same: dismiss, reclassify, remove, forget. In that light, the Arkansas rail cut stops being a weird local anecdote and starts looking like a miniature of a larger system. A crew uncovers something that does not fit the accepted history. Non-specialists see it first. Officials arrive quickly. Access narrows. Objects leave the site. Documentation thins out. The space is closed. Later generations inherit only rumor and fragments. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because the same mechanism appears in buried city stories too. Lower windows beneath modern streets, sealed doors under basements, entire floors below grade that nobody wants to explain except with convenient phrases like raised street level or urban fill, even when the scale feels excessive. Again and again, the public is told the answer is ordinary, practical, settled. But ordinary explanations often arrive faster than careful investigation. That speed is the tell. When institutions know exactly what something is before they have fully examined it, skepticism is not irrational, it is earned. Now look at Arkansas itself. River country, old earthworks, forgotten ridges, quarry scars, rail expansion cutting through places local memory had left alone for generations. If older populations used high ground for burial, lookout points, or ceremonial chambers, then industrial excavation would have been the perfect machine for exposing and destroying those spaces in the same motion. Discovery and erasure, all in one contract. And maybe that is why witness testimony matters so much here. Official history likes documents because documents can be curated. Testimony is messier. It leaks. It survives in kitchens, porches, funerals, and family retellings.
A signed report can disappear into a file room, but a man who comes home shaken and says they filled it before breakfast puts a stain on the story that paper can never fully clean. There is also a deeper reason the chamber may have needed to vanish. Size changes meaning. A bone chamber is interesting. A giant bone chamber is destabilizing. Because if the remains were truly human in form but outside accepted proportions, then the issue is not just anatomy, it is chronology, it is migration, it is social memory. It is whether earlier populations were larger, different, or connected to traditions modern history treats as folklore. It is whether myth sometimes begins as damaged memory of real bodies and real places. And once you admit that possibility, the walls separating legend from evidence start to look very thin. So the chamber had to become a collapse. The bones had to become confusion, and the ridge had to become just another cut through Arkansas dirt. That's how buried history survives in public, not as proof, but as a wound in the record that never quite heals.
Now imagine for a moment that the witnesses were basically right. Not perfect, not precise, but right. Imagine there really was a worked chamber inside that ridge. Imagine the remains were arranged. Imagine the bones were far larger than expected. Imagine one or more items were removed before the opening was sealed. What follows from that? First, the local implication is enormous. It would mean somebody in the deep past had the labor, planning, and cultural motive to create hidden burial architecture in Arkansas substantial enough to survive inside a hill until industrial blasting ripped it open. That alone would challenge the lazy assumption that whole regions of North America were thinly storied, simple, or historically blank before the modern record took over. But the size issue drives it much further. If large human remains were found and intentionally suppressed, then we are no longer talking about a quirky regional mystery. We are talking about the possibility that parts of the continent once held populations, lineages, or elite burial classes whose physical scale became too inconvenient to preserve inside a neat national narrative. Not monsters, not fairy tale caricatures, just human forms big enough to trigger panic in anyone whose career depends on certainty. And panic creates behavior. Fast reburial, quiet transcourt, no photography, no open measurement, no open excavation, no messy questions from locals, no debates about scriptural giants, mound cultures, pre-contact complexity, or oral traditions that suddenly sound less symbolic than historians prefer. This is why stories like the Arkansas Chamber grip people so hard. They sit at the intersection of three forbidden things at once: buried remains, missing records, and scale. Take away any one of those and the mystery weakens. Put all three together and the story becomes radioactive. Because scale is the one detail that forces everybody to choose a side. Either the witnesses were wrong, lying, drunk, confused, misled by shadows, or trapped in frontier exaggeration, or they saw something that should have generated a century of follow-up and somehow generated almost none. That gap is the real evidence feel. Not a laboratory report, not a polished museum case, the gap. The oversized silence around an oversized discovery. And then there's the civilizational implication nobody likes to say out loud. If ancient North America contains more sealed chambers, larger remains, and lower buried structures than the public is comfortable entertaining, then history may not be missing a few details. It may be missing a whole mood, a whole chapter of human presence that was not primitive in the way schoolbook timelines like to imply. A chapter of builders, barriers, keepers, and lineages whose dead were hidden in worked spaces, whose traces were later cut through, graded over, renamed, or carted away as curiosities.
Once that possibility enters the room, every rail cut, quarry wall, old courthouse basement, and hilltop excavation starts to feel less innocent. How many foundations stand over sealed levels? How many roads crossed chambered ridges? How many reports were softened just enough to keep the machine moving? And how many people, ordinary people, saw the truth for a few minutes before authority arrived and told them to forget what their own eyes had already done to them? That may be the most haunting part of the Arkansas story. Not that something impossible was found, but that it may have been found by men with no power to stop what came next. They were there first, and it still was not enough.
So we come back to the ridge, to lantern light, wet clay, iron tools, a hollow strike in the dark, to the worker leaning in and seeing a chamber where there should have been packed earth, to the pale curve of bone emerging from the wall, to the terrible recognition that the thing in front of him was not an animal, not a trick of roots, not a pile of blasted debris, but a body chamber too deliberate to be natural and too large to fit comfortably inside the story of the land. And then to the rush, the orders, the silence, the strangers, the wrapped items, the dirt pushed back in before the day could fully look at it. That is why this case lingers. Because whether you believe every detail or not, the emotional shape of it rings true to hidden history, discovery, containment, denial, forgetting. Then decades later, fragments rising through families and local whispers like bones through shallow soil. Maybe the Arkansas giant bone chamber was the burial of one extraordinary individual. Maybe it held several. Maybe the witnesses misjudged size in the shock of first exposure, or maybe they did not. Maybe what terrified them was not just the chamber itself, but the feeling that they had stumbled into a world older, stranger, and more organized than they had ever been told to imagine. A world where the ground was not empty before modern America arrived, but layered, guarded, built over, and in some cases deliberately hidden under the language of progress. That is what the backfill means. Backfill is not just dirt. Backfill is policy. Backfill is memory management. Backfill is what happens when a discovery is too disruptive to display and too undeniable to leave open. And once you see it that way, the rail cut becomes more than a local mystery. It becomes a symbol of something much bigger, the exact moment when buried history almost reached daylight and was shoved back underground before the public could ask the wrong question. So the next time you pass an old rail line cutting through a hill or stand in a downtown block where basement windows vanish below the street, or hear some half-laughed story about giant bones, sealed rooms, or lower levels no one can explain, remember this. A false history does not survive by proving everything. It survives by burying just enough. And the people who notice that pattern, the people who hear the hollow sound under the official version, are usually the same people who understand this channel without needing it explained. They know the archive is not the whole story. They know the map is not the territory. And they know the earth remembers what paper does not. If that is you, stay close, because the truth is rarely gone. Most of the time, it's just waiting under one more layer of fill.